I grew up in a town in rural Connecticut. The village I live in is relatively small. When I was a preteen, there was a minimum to no actual crime in the town. My family lives pretty much scattered throughout the village, and then in the next town over. And while it was a quiet walk, I used to go over to my cousin's house pretty much every weekend because I had nothing to do at home. Now for reference, my cousin's house is explained in my Ouija story. I would go over there during the day, but almost always go home at night because I could not, for the life of me, sleep comfortably in that house. But that's a whole other story. Anyways, my cousin's house is down in the valley of the town. The valley is the home of a man-made pond called Knife Shop. The reason it's called such was that it was made specifically to help power a large knife company that once resided in my hometown, long before I was born. This knife company was eventually bought out, and as explained in other stories I've told more recently, the last standing building of the knife shop is in my backyard, though now I'm a tad off topic. The knife shop was taken down, and a majority of the town is actually skate parks, though not listed. As a kid, I used to love going and exploring the woods with my cousins on the weekends. We almost always found an old section of the knife shop's foundation and made a little hut in it, or we played on or in the giant waterfalls that were once used to power the shop. There were many occasions when my cousins and I would be playing in the woods, then follow a path up around the waterfalls, and we'd end up in a cemetery. My town has a very, very small cemetery that is split in two pieces, the old part and the new. We always ended up in the old part. I was never comfortable walking around in the old cemetery. On to the actual point in all this. My cousins and I popped out of the woods one day, around noon, and started to walk the driveway of the cemetery back to the road. Halfway there, we stopped and found a turtle that had been crushed. But it wasn't on the road. It was on a headstone. So we sort of freaked out and left. Unfortunately, in order for me to get home, I had to walk back past the cemetery to go up the large hill where my house was. Around 4 or 5, I started my hike home. As I was passing the cemetery, I saw a woman standing in the middle of the headstones watching me. She was definitely not alive. I could see through her. It's hard to explain what she looks like. She had long wiry hair and a sneer on her face. She was in clothes probably from the 1800s. I actually froze on the grass next to the road and couldn't move for a moment or two. Then she cackled. I stood frozen and quiet for a moment before I booked it. I've got to say that I never ran the mile when I was in school. I always walked it, but I ran a mile uphill to my house and got there in under 10 minutes. Now in my mid-20s, I go down to the cemetery to pay my respects to my grandparents. My cousin and then I go into the old part of the cemetery to pay respects to all of my relatives in there. I have not seen that woman since, nor have any more dead animals shown up in that cemetery. I generally don't know why or who would have done any of that to bring about something as sinister as that woman. I can say very, very confidently that she radiated evil. And when I walk through the old cemetery now, I actually avoid the headstones where she stood. This was definitely the scariest experience of my life, even though I have recently more begun to work on my mediumship, and as I am sensitive to the other side, I have yet to experience another spirit as terrifying. My group of friends is extremely interested in the paranormal. We've had several ghost hunting encounters in graveyards, mostly via voice recordings, but we've never had anything like this. Tonight, as the sun was setting, We went to a family cemetery outside of town that we had seen several times. We always found some excuse not to go there at night, but with the sun still casting shadows over the gravestones, it didn't seem nearly as foreboding as it had before. We were wrong. It started out well. The cemetery is extremely old and in horrible disrepair. The gravestones near the front that were still legible read from the mid-1800s. We counted at least a dozen plots for children, affirmed as children's plots not by the alleged markers, but from the stone borders that surround most of the plots. Near the back of the cemetery was a small area with between 10 and 12 markers, under the shade of a large tree. By the time we reached this area, the sun had set and dusk was quickly darkening. My boyfriend had a horrible feeling like he was going to throw up, and said we should go back to the truck, but I was insistent. It seemed like something was pulling me back to the shaded markers. I argued with him for a moment, and told him that I was going to go and look at the graves, and then we could leave. As soon as I turned back towards the graves and lifted my foot, I became extremely lightheaded and found that my legs would not carry me any further. I began to shake all over, and I could not move back toward the exit of the cemetery. After struggling with a wave of nausea and dizziness for a moment, my vision began to blur, and I surrendered. One thought filled my head because my mouth could not move. As soon as I conceded that I wouldn't leave, and that I did not mean to invade their privacy, my foot touched the ground, and I am not ashamed to say that I hit the ground running. The sickness lingered, and even when I arrived home, I was still suffering from sweats, chills, and vomiting. To any Central Texans who may be reading this story, do not attempt to enter graveyard on CR 224. Even in groups, it is not safe. I only hope that this illness will pass. I've certainly learned my lesson. Last year of April 2017, after a particularly brutal semester of graduate school, I decided to take a week off from work and spend it in northeast Minnesota along the shores of Lake Superior. I spent the first half of my vacation in Duluth and two harbors doing some hiking, mountain biking, and other activities, while I decided to spend the other half in Grand Marias, which is a small town about 2 hours up the shore from Duluth. As I was settling into my hotel room, I decided to see if there were any haunted places in the area. This is because earlier in the week, I had taken a tour of Glenshith Mansion in Duluth, and during the tour, our guide mentioned that there were rumors that the ghost of someone who was murdered there still roamed the hallways. As I looked up if there were any haunted places around Grand Marias, the name Maple Hill Cemetery popped up a few times, mostly on some haunted places website that had a web design that looked like it came from the early 2000s. The most common sighting there consisted of a man holding a lantern. Nevertheless, I saw that the postings were fairly recent and within the past few years. So the following morning, I punched in the location of Maple Hill Cemetery into my phone GPS, and it led me straight there from my hotel room. To give you an idea of what this place is like, Maple Hill Cemetery is located about 2 to 3 miles up the Gunflint Trail from the Grand Marias, and you get there by turning off onto a gravel dirt road from the Gunflint itself. There are trees on both sides of the road that only get taller the further back you go, and there are also a couple of old houses that are tucked into the forest which are visible on the left. When you get to what appears to be a dead end, the road makes an abrupt left. After driving another 500 feet, you'll come to the cemetery itself. The road continues through the cemetery, but there's a three-way intersection in the middle of one of the roads, turning west towards a dead end where cars can park. The cemetery has an old wooden church in the center, and there are a mix of old and new gravestones dotting the premises. Maple Hill is on somewhat of a slight decline, which goes from west to east, and since this is the north woods of Minnesota, there are a lot of thick pine trees surrounding the cemetery plot. When I pulled in, it was a cloudy day, and while the snow had melted by the shores of Lake Superior and in Grand Marias, there are still patches of snow near and behind the tree line surrounding the cemetery, since temperatures further back from the lake tend to be much cooler, but the snow still was melting that day since it was warm enough. Because of this, the western half of the cemetery had a lingering fog hovering just above the ground, which was pooling out from the western tree line. As I got out of my car, the first thing I noticed was that the air felt heavy compared to the other places I had been that day. Whether or not it was because of the melting of the snow or condensation is anyone's guess. However, as I started wandering around the cemetery, I noticed that it was extremely quiet, and I had this feeling that someone was watching me. About maybe 10 minutes of walking around and taking photos, I was standing right by the entrance to the old church, when I asked quietly if anyone was there, and within a minute of me doing so, I felt what I can only describe a pair of fingers brush the back of my head. I immediately turned around and saw no one there. Again, I asked if anyone was there, though this time I did so in a louder tone of voice. Afterwards, I started walking north towards the entrance of the cemetery, from which I came in from my car, when the air around me became extremely cold over the course of maybe 10 minutes. Now, it was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit that April morning, so it was already chilly, but the sensation I felt made it seem like it was easily 20 degrees cooler. As this was happening, I had a feeling of paralysis come over me. Not so much in the sense that I couldn't move any part of my body, but rather that I was afraid to move. I felt as if I would be punished if I did so move as much from that spot, and a sense of fear came over me. In addition, that sensation of being watched got ever more stronger with each passing second, and that I felt that my mind was becoming clouded. I stood there for a couple of minutes before I whispered loudly, "Let me go." Almost immediately, I felt my mind clear up, that I could move again without fear, and the air around me seemed to warm back up to what it was before. After this happened, I began walking straight to my car since I made the decision to leave. When I saw that I can only describe as a gray translucent mist-like figure darting between the trees in the western tree line of the cemetery. At first I thought it was the fog, until I saw it weave left and right in between the trees as it moved along the cemetery border. At first it kept moving right before a sudden turn towards the woods until it was out of sight. I couldn't make out any features aside from that it looked to be about 6 feet tall, and that it seemed to glide on the ground. As I was leaving in my car, I still had this feeling that something was watching me, and it didn't go away until I had made the right-hand turn back towards the Gunflint Trail. Frankly, my only thought at this point was that I needed to get the hell out of there. As soon as I made it back to the main road, I floated back towards the Grand Marias. Even almost a year later, I still can't explain what I saw that day. I have done some research in regards to what happened with my paralysis-clouded mind, and that it may have been a potential possession, but everything else has left me dumbfounded.